Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a neutral domain masquerading as a podcast rapidly undergoing politicisation. For this episode, we were lucky enough to talk with Dr Jon Wittrock. I apologise for my pronunciation of Swedish names, but I'm doing my best and enjoying myself too. Anyway, he's an associate professor and senior lecturer at the University of Malmö in political science. He knows a lot about Carl Schmitt and was able to guide Levi and me through many of Schmitt's interesting ideas in this episode. And who was Carl Schmitt? He was one of Germany's most prominent legal theorists during the early 20th century, being born in the German Empire in 1888, serving in the First World War, writing prolifically about the legal and political problems of the Weimar years, and, most notoriously, joining the Nazi Party in 1933, before being denounced by the SS in 1936 for, among other things, and this is one of the most German things to have ever happened, for suspicions of neo-Hegelianism. This episode, we mostly focused on two of Schmitt's key works, Political Theology, published in 1922, and The Concept of the Political, the second edition of which was published in 1932, and which we read for this episode. If you've heard mentions of the friend-enemy distinction, the decision of the exception determining sovereignty, depoliticization and neutralization, and more, then you'll get a lot out of this episode. And now, on to more important matters. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon, you can hear upcoming episodes early, and we have weekly voice chats with our subscribers. I've also published a novel called Tower, the first few chapters of which are available for free on my Substack, the link to which is in the show notes. We also have a Discord server for this podcast on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is once again in the show notes. Finally, if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate us on your podcast app of choice, like our videos on YouTube, etc., and so on. In short, feed the algorithm, make it like us, these things really do help. So, if you're ready to politicise this space and identify your group's enemy, then listen on. Enjoy. So for this episode, we're really pleased to have on Jon Wittrock.
Yeah, that's fine, or Jon Wittrock, or Jon Wittrock, whatever you prefer.
Before recording, I asked what the correct way to pronounce your name was, and you were like, "Oh, just say it the English way."
Yeah, that's fine.
So Jon reached out to us. I think it was after we published our episode on, I think the latest younger one on the Forest Passage. Right. Where we mentioned offhand something about Schmitt. And anyway, we got an email saying, "Hi, I'm a Swedish academic. I know a lot about Schmitt. Do you want to talk to me about Schmitt?" We said, yes, that sounds really good.
And that was pleasing both because it's talking about Schmitt, who we've been meaning to read probably for a while now. I'm sure we might have mentioned him on the show before. But also because you're Swedish, as I mentioned before we went on air, John. We've got heaps of Swedish listeners per capita, so shout out to all the Swedes in the audience.
Yeah,
we've got one of your countrymen on to educate us on one of the greatest Nazis in history.
Yeah, could you introduce yourself, John?
Yeah, so my name is Jon Wittrock, if you want to go with the English pronunciation, or Jon Wittrock in Swedish, and I'm a lecturer at Malmö University currently, where I teach political philosophy and human rights. And I've also written about Carl Schmitt for those listening from Sweden. I've written a book on Carl Schmitt that you can access for free from the Malmö University Library website, and I've written an essay on Carl Schmitt for Statsvetenskaplig tidskrift that you can also access for free. And in English, I've written several book chapters on Carl Schmitt in various anthologies, which you probably cannot read for free, sadly. But I also wrote an article on Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger, which I think is available for free, on their respective critiques of nihilism. And I have an official website via Malmö University. So you can just access stuff from there, or you can just Google my name or Google my name and Malmö University. And there you also have contact details. So I have a university email address that you can use if you want to reach out to me. So I've written a bit about Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger. I also know quite a lot about Ernst Jünger. I never wrote about him, but I've read him.
Nice. Yeah, cool. What was your favorite Jünger text that you've come across so far?
In terms of novels, there's one called Sturm. S-T-E. You've read it, or?
No, that's one of the ones that I want to read. It's like, I mean, there's a bunch of his that I want to read,
Yes.
but that one looks really, really compelling.
Yes, it might be the best.
Yeah, cool.
It's really, really, really good. On the Marble Cliffs, it's really fascinating. Also, the diaries from World War II are fascinating. So yeah, I mean, he wrote a lot, but.
Right.
Yeah.
And what are your current projects that you're working on? Is there anything that you're writing at the moment, or any particular classes that you're teaching at the moment that are interesting, that our listeners might find interesting?
Well, I'm going to teach a class on Carl Schmitt.
Oh, nice. There you go. That's awesome. Fantastic.
Yeah, but right now I'm mostly actually writing more in the style of analytical philosophy about autonomy and human rights.
Oh, really?
So
Yeah,
it's
cool.
quite different, but yeah, a lot about. I written an article on sexuality and human rights and justice, which I think is kind of interesting, which you can read for free, for example. And I've tried to develop a framework for thinking about autonomy that is multidimensional. So avoiding some of the pitfalls I see in simplified notions of freedom or liberty. And then
is that autonomy with respect to collective autonomy or individual autonomy, or both, or various aspects of it?
So that's a good question. So far it's mostly individual autonomy. I'm trying to solve collective autonomy, but it's extremely difficult. Right. It's very, very hard. That's kind of the greatest dilemma I see in political philosophy and sort of adjacent to international law is this notion of collective autonomy. It's not been solved. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah, that's a gigantic problem.
Yes.
Great. And today you're here to talk with Jack and I about Carl Schmitt. How good. Jack, what was it about this book or Carl Schmitt that got you interested? Like, why did you want to read his stuff?
So I read him, or this book, a few years ago, as well as another text of his, the two of which I think, or at least are considered, and John can correct me on this if he disagrees, considered to be sort of the core of Schmitt's philosophy. This and another text called Political Theology. I read them a few years ago because I'd basically heard of Schmitt as one of the chief legal theorists of Nazism, this really, really controversial man who nonetheless was, at least in the background in an unstated way, highly influential on how the law is thought of, or how questions of, say, sovereignty or the political are still thought of today. And so that idea of this occult influence by a Nazi theorist, that combination of the forbidden and also academic rigor had me really interested. So I read the text and thought they were really, really interesting. And then once we started doing this podcast, Schmitt felt like a fairly clear choice because, again, he combines, like, he was a Nazi party member. He joined in 1933. So there's that controversy, and especially like hard right controversy that our listeners just can't seem to get enough of. Combined with genuine philosophical insight that makes him so fascinating and such a clear fit for this show.
Nice.
And what about...
I was interested.
How are you feeling coming into it?
I guess these sorts of continental European thinkers, I suppose, and to a lesser degree, some of the modern American thinkers that are kind of, I suppose, anti-democratic in various ways, are just interesting because I have been so thoroughly influenced by people like Karl Popper, who's obviously like classical liberal, and David Deutsch, and probably a slew of other people that I may or may not have mentioned on the show at some point over the course of the last couple of years. And so it's just been interesting to read opposing points of view on these different essentially on liberalism in the not in the Australian political sense, but like in the I suppose like British sense of the word, and not in the American sense either. But like free enterprise, democracy, sort of governance by consent, constrained state, all these sorts of things, and those values, I guess, having them challenged is important. And I think unless you actively go out of your way to find opposing points of view, you can easily get rabbit holed into just reaffirming what you want, whatever you want. And I guess the thing with Schmitt in particular is, like, as I found out more about him, he also seems to have to be quite influential. I don't know if the correspondences I was seeing, and it'd be great to talk to Jon a bit more in depth about this, but there's so much stuff around collective identity. I couldn't help but think, like, how much has Schmitt's thinking permeated into modern, like, almost left-wing academic sort of thinking? I don't know if there's some background, like, direct connection, or if it's more just he's been so influential that it's sort of permeated into the academic zeitgeist. I'm not sure. But there just seem to be a lot of parallels, and it's very interesting, obviously, because he's associated with the Nazi Party, which obviously people like Antifa would not like. So it's interesting to see these parallels between thinking. So it's interesting to be challenged as usual. And I think what I found with Justin Murphy when he came on is because I think that was the first interview where it was like we were talking about the concept with or the author with somebody who's like a deep expert in the author, if I'm not mistaken. And so to have another opportunity to do that again, and
we talked about Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation for that episode.
Yeah,
it was good having
really educational
Murphy on too, because he got a lot more out of the book than I did, and so talking to him about it was really, really good.
Yeah, cool. So
what about Jon? We talked about this a little bit before recording, but could you go over what got you interested in Schmitt?
Sure, but I just want to address some of the things you said. Both of you mentioned Schmitt's influence, and I think you understate it, right?
Okay, cool.
He's hugely influential, and his influence is really growing, right?
Right.
He has always been influential. He was influential in his own times. He was influential, obviously, in the Weimar Republic, very influential. Post-war, he was a bit marginalized, but he continued to be very influential in German legal thinking, for example. But currently, we can mention Chantal Mouffe and Giorgio Agamben, who are two very prominent academics associated with the left, who draw a lot on Carl Schmitt, and those are just two of the most prominent. But Schmitt is also been hugely influential in China. since the 90s.
Really?
Yes, so there's a term, Schmitt fever, used to discuss Schmitt's influence in China. Schmitt's been very influential in Russia and, adjacent to the current order there. He's been very influential on some of the key ideas. And he has been, of course, very influential for the alt-right. And he's also influential in the debates between alt-right and NRX. I know you've talked about some. I didn't listen to those episodes, I think, but I know you've talked about some NRX, some neo-reactionary.
Yeah, particularly Nick Land, Spandrel, and Curtis Yarvin we've talked about.
Right. So I mean, Schmitt is ridiculously influential, basically.
Yeah.
You find him anywhere. I
don't know if you want to get into this later on now, John, but I'd be curious, could you give us what's your understanding of why do you think Schmitt and his thinking has been so influential, and why it's also had lasting power, at least over the last sort of 70 years?
I mean, I think there's an easy answer to the second question. It's simply that he's a very smart guy. So he actually, he made very salient points. You mentioned before, critiques of liberalism and democracy, and his critiques are very sharp. And he was early with pointing to some problems that resurfaced later on. Also, he, in terms of his works, he writes well. He can be pretty funny. He can be fairly clear. Yeah, so that's also an advantage.
I'm not used to reading German authors who are this straightforward. Like, I'm expecting Spengler prose or Heidegger prose.
Yeah, I think
when I read a German.
He
Schmitt was
stands out.
shockingly clear.
Yes, and quite funny at times. Then I think we'll get to that, but this notion of the political, of politicization, and of the political preceding economy and preceding rights is something that people both on the left and the right appreciate a lot. Because Schmitt, in the concept of the political, he points to a liberal tendency to replace the political with basically ethics and or economy. And I think that's something lots of people see today in liberal discourse, where you say this isn't a matter of political conflict, it's a matter of, economic technicalities or human rights. So it's beyond contestation, basically, and that's the tendency Schmitt pointed to. So I think that's, something both left and right leaning people appreciate a lot. But these are just some examples,
Just before we get into the book proper, I was just reading your profile on the university website, and I liked the way that it's put in your profiles. It says your emphasis is on exploring the conceptual borderlands between the religious and the secular. I was wondering if you could just briefly talk a little bit to that, what your investigations are, and it seems like that would also be relevant to Schmitt, right? Obviously. So if you could also introduce us to how that might come into Schmitt's work as well.
I mean, Schmitt also, he has capacity for these catchphrases, right? So in political theology, he talks about this notion of secularized theological concepts. I'd say that particular observation is kind of a big deal at least in German intellectual debates in the first half and middle of the 20th century. Lots of people made the point that supposedly secular ideologies are actually religious or analogous to religious, right? Let's very commonplace observation that you could view Marxism as a kind of religion, for example, right? Many people, both Marxists and anti-Marxists, have made this point. You have Che Guevara himself writes in the Motorcycle Diaries, describes himself essentially as in religious terms at the end. You have Lukács, the famous Hungarian thinker, who said that for him it was like a conversion, becoming a Marxist, and so on. So there has been this debate throughout the 20th century. You have Vogelin, who called, basically talked about the immanentization of eschatology, how socialist and liberal ideologies can be viewed as kind of immanent eschatologies, right? But I would say there's also a analytical problem with the term religion, right? Because religions are not things, but constellations of practices and ideas. So it's kind of arbitrary where you draw the line there, depending on what you look at. I don't know how deep to go into that, but essentially at some point it becomes a bit arbitrary what you call religious and secular. You can also see empirically that the whole notion of secularity is very dubious. Again, it just depends on how you fixate these things, how you define them. You can say, okay, this country is very secular because people don't go to church, but then, okay, but the majority of the population believe in something higher, and so on, and they have these ritual behaviors, and so on and so on. Nationalism has also commonly been described as a kind of like a pseudo-religion.
Democracy sausages and stuff in Australia.
Yeah. So
Jack, did you want to kick us off with the episode specific?
I reckon talking a bit about the context behind Schmitt's thought would be pretty illuminating, especially many of his views on liberalism and democracy, and also the specific questions that he was trying to solve with certain works are very concrete. Like, Schmitt was a very concrete man. Like, he was interested in affecting change in the world rather than just theorizing about it. For example, political theology in large part was written in response to constitutional crises in the Weimar Republic and trying to encourage, in 22, was Hindenburg president? I forget, but trying to encourage the president to invoke Article 48 of the Constitution in an unlimited way to try to remove particularly the hard left and hard right parties from destroying the constitutional order. So anyway, I think it'd be really valuable to talk a bit about that before going on to talking about the concept of the political and other works of Schmitt's in more detail, because that concreteness, at least to me, is very, very characteristic of Schmitt, how he's trying to fix problems with his works, and if we can know what those problems are, it'll contextualize things nicely for listeners. So, John, I know you said before this that you're not a historian, and we're not expecting you to give in an intensely detailed account of Germany in, say, the 1920s, but could you talk a bit about what the problems that Schmitt was trying to address were?
I mean, if you look at the concept of the political, you could say, I agree with you. Like, you could say, oh, the theoretical problem is defining the political, but no, that's not. That's not the driving motivation here. He's not, going through different notions of the political throughout history and so on. His problem is very concrete and contemporary to him, in a sense, right? He was in a political crisis, and he talks about human beings being dangerous and dynamic. So yes, he lived through the emergence and end of the Weimar Republic, right? So after World War I, Germany established a liberal democracy that was never particularly stable, and there emerged lots of movements, of course, on the left and right that weren't particularly keen on this liberal democracy. And as you know, there was fighting in the streets and large sort of political armies almost, right? So very unstable times. And Schmitt, so this is the key contentious issue, right? So defenders of Schmitt will say he tried to save the Weimar Republic, and his opponents will say he tried to end the Weimar Republic. And I think that depends quite a bit on how you view the Weimar Republic, right? So if you see the Weimar Republic as being primarily a liberal democracy, you can say he tried to end it. But if you view the Weimar Republic as being a republic and not a communist or Nazi government, yes, then he tried to save it. Okay? So his key argument throughout is to point to theoretical and practical problems of liberal democracy and to argue for a strong executive, right? Basically, as you say, yes. And I think it's important to remember his context, right? You have a context where democracy is seeming to be on the verge of collapse. You have communists and Nazis out fighting in the streets. And he's saying, like, this is ridiculous. We should just arrest these people, right? That might not be the liberally correct thing to do, but at some point there has to be a strong sovereign that can do what needs to be done in order to preserve this order, right? That's the basic argument, and we can understand why this is still a relevant argument, right? To what an extent do you need always to respect individual rights and due procedure, and to what an extent do you need sometimes to just have a strong hand that just does what needs to be done? That's sort of, putting it simply, that's the basic argument. And for Schmitt, this is not a theoretical game. This was the actual situation he was in, right? There are lots of controversies here, right? Some people will argue like, no, actually he only wanted to target the left, and so on. Again, I'm not an historian and I don't want to go in depth, but we can remember that in Austria at this time, there was a right-wing authoritarian order that was against the Nazis. So it's not like completely hypothetical here, right? And I know you've talked in previous episodes about how today we use Nazi and fascist as kind of generic terms. But back in the 20s and 30s, no, the Nazis, they're like a political party. It's not a generic term, right? There are lots of right-wing parties that are against democracy that, to a greater or lesser extent, are opposed to the Nazis, right? So the Nazis are a specific movement here, but there are lots of movements here. So you can easily conceive of a development where Germany develops into a not Nazi kind of dictatorship, right? And this seems to be what Schmitt would have preferred, right? So then you get into kind of the debate on would that have been better? And I think, yeah, lots of people today would say in hindsight, yeah, it probably would, right? If you look at Austria before the Nazis took over, and you look at Nazi Germany, like, which is preferable, right? But of course, back in those days, the people didn't know the future, right? So, I mean, it's easy to make that argument in hindsight. It's not so easy when you're in it. But yeah, so this is where you get a huge debate. But this is his basic argument about sovereignty is that yes, the sovereign needs to be able to basically to put it crudely, break the law to preserve the law, right? Sometimes, so something like that.
And you brought up that Schmitt's fundamental anthropology is that human beings are dangerous.
Yes.
And getting onto a bit of probably less historical, now more philosophical background and context of what Schmitt's doing. So when I hear that, that sounds like Thomas Hobbes. And Schmitt was very influenced by Hobbes. He brings up Hobbes quite a lot.
Yes.
Could you talk about the link between Hobbes and Schmitt, and maybe Aristotle and Schmitt too, if that's not, I mean, if it's not going too deep? Because that constellation of those three thinkers also seems really important to understanding Schmitt's work.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I mentioned how, he wrote a book on the political, and he doesn't really bring up Aristotle, which is weird, right? If his aims were just philosophical and theoretical, that would have been very strange. Because Aristotle is the most famous thinker who talks about human beings as political animals, right? So, and to Aristotle, that does not. We have this expression like man is a political animal. I guess lots of people have heard without knowing what it means, right? It sounds kind of cool and paradoxical. But it has a more specific meaning, right? Aristotle is not saying human beings are the only political animals. He's saying some animals are political because they build societies together and they act in a coordinated fashion. That's what it means, right? So Aristotle stresses the notion of cooperation, right? And sympathy, right? And Schmitt stresses the opposite, but he never mentions Aristotle or his conceptualization, right? So Schmitt defines political as friend-enemy, whereas Aristotle basically defines political as friends, friendship. I mean, he even uses that term. But yeah, Hobbes, Schmitt refers to Hobbes repeatedly, right? He wrote a whole book on Leviathan later on during the Nazi times, and he brings up Hobbes many times in his works. Which is a bit strange. Schmitt was a Catholic. Hobbes wrote, a sizable part of Leviathan is about how bad Catholicism is.
Yeah.
So, but Schmitt loved Hobbes. Yeah, it's a bit strange because I think they're quite different in many ways as thinkers. And there are also, but Schmitt emphasizes this notion of protection and obedience and order. He loves that notion, right? He is very preoccupied with order, Schmitt.
Yep.
And again, if we remember what he lived through, that's not particularly strange.
And
right?
Hobbes as well, actually.
Right,
Hobbes' preoccupation with stability as well.
Yes, exactly. Right. So Schmitt lived through, he saw the collapse of the empire, he saw the Weimar Republic, all the chaos during that, the collapse of that. Yeah, of course you're preoccupied with order, right? So both of them are preoccupied with order and fear and the dangers of instability, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, that was... So I read Leviathan quite a few years ago and didn't study it either. So I'm not able to speak to particular points of Hobbes. But yeah, that emphasis on stability and the obligation of obedience to one who protects you seemed to be the big link between Hobbes and Schmitt, at least in my mind. Also because so much of Leviathan is talking about like mental geometry and how he doesn't like Catholics.
Yeah.
The more fun bits of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the general, we'll eventually get to defining what Schmitt means by the political and the friend-enemy distinction, which is what I imagine many listeners know of Schmitt. We'll eventually get to that. But one thing that really strikes me about Schmitt, and this is reflected in the shape of most of his thought that I've come across, is that things like law, things like states, or any of those sort of entities are human constructions and are limited. Human beings themselves are limited in their ability to think, their ability to be moral, in basically anything that humans do. Whereas underlying reality, including humans, especially humans, is chaotic. It's hard to predict. You can't enumerate a series of possible situations and then responses to them, because such an enumeration will always fall short of what could possibly happen. There's always going to be some sort of exceptional circumstance that arises that's not going to be subsumed within whatever conceptual system you've built. And so, at least from what I've read of Schmitt, basically everything he's talking about is A, concretely directed towards some sort of problem he sees. He's quite practical. And B, it tends to actually be, rather than him trying to devise an airtight system that can be placed on the world and operate autonomously, he prefers to offer criteria by which you can think about things and then flexibly respond to the chaos of the world. Does that sound like a fair characterization to you?
Yes. I think there's a lot to that. He repeatedly tries to point to, for example, in his later works, when he talks about the foundations of political order, the Nomos of the Earth, is a major later work on that, and he says, like, ultimately order is based on a land grab. Right? It's right. Yes, you have constitutions and principles, but basically it's like taking and seizing and keeping land. Right, the Landnahme. That's the foundation of order, right? So it points back to that very grubby basic fact, right? And yes, and he says, yeah, the political is ultimately about the potential for deadly violence, and he's, as you say, I'm not going to, again, not go deep into it, but there was kind of a debate in Germany and in German law about how specific should the law be, right? Whereas some people, some German legal scholars in the 19th century thought like the law should be super specific and mention all possibilities, and that's it's ridiculous, right? And so again, that points also to his notion of the sovereign, as the sovereign is who decides on the exception, who decides whether there is an exception and what to do about it. You need this sovereign power that is inside and outside of the law, that preserves the order, but at times does so by not strictly following the rules, right? Preserves the order over time and needs to be able to be very flexible in that. But I mean, yes, but you could also say there are problems with his solutions that he doesn't really address, right? So he is a very sharp critic of liberal democracy. He's very good at pointing to flaws, but I wouldn't say his own solutions are always watertight either.
That's often the case.
Yeah. So,
in terms of then laying out particularly his criticisms, but also maybe some of his solutions in the concept of the political, also his thought more generally. So this is a big question, but I think this gets at a lot of the meat of this book. Could you separate out for us what Schmitt means when he talks about the political, politics, law, and the state? Because I feel like his definitions of those things really illuminates a lot of what he's trying to do here.
So maybe we should just say something briefly about this work, the concept of the political, which is a kind of a brief essay that he wrote in the early 30s, and the basic point famously is that the political can be understood in terms of the difference between friend and enemy. And this means that the political can be found in politics, but the two can also be separated, right? So the political can erupt anywhere, right? Anywhere where people divide into friend and enemies with the potential for deadly violence, you get the political. So you can conceive of politics without the political. And this is one... So basically, what would politics be without the political? I think you could argue, based on Schmitt, well, then politics would fail to engage people. This is what Chantal Mouffe develops later on, right? If politics is just a empty kind of spectacle without any substantial conflicts, it becomes a bit meaningless. And conversely, the political can erupt anywhere. So the political is different. And the political is this underlies everything else. So the state is then a kind of political entity. It's basically an attempt at stabilizing the political, right? As Hobbes basically argued in his terms, right? You have a kind of a system that creates some predictability in this pattern of violence, right? And that's the state is one solution. It's not the only solution. This Schmitt doesn't say that, but in his times, it's the basic paradigm for this. But you can think of other political entities, right? You can think of a company becoming a political entity if it handles the political, or you can think of a church and so on, right? So the state is a way of handling the political. You can't. This is his kind of one of his points against what he thinks of as liberal utopianism and so on. But you can't just remove the political from the world. It's probably not realistic. So you will have this possibility of deadly violence, and you will have conflicts, but you can stabilize this, and the state is a way of doing that. And if you also have law, right, well, it's another way of handling the political and channeling it in predictable patterns, right? But the law is ultimately rooted in the political. Right? The law is structured in terms of a constitution in a constitutional state, and the constitution, well, what does it ultimately rest on? Well, it doesn't ultimately rest on principles or ideals. It ultimately rests on the political. Right? Think of the American Revolution, for example. Right? So you ultimately have this. Yes, this is conflict. There's deadly violence. And then, in Schmitt's view, you get the decision on a constitutional order, right? So the political is underlying all these other phenomena, and you need to, well, you should, if you want to theorize about these things, you need to remember that, or you should remember that. Schmitt thinks this is one of his critiques against kind of systems of thought, where you say, like, okay, we have these moral axioms, or we have these basic constitutional principles, and it just becomes like it's a machine with no outside, right? It's self-contained system, whereas Schmitt always emphasizes, when you think of these systems, they need to be thought in relation to what lies outside them, which I think is his basic point in political theology. Is you should always think of these coherent systems as ultimately relating to something outside of these coherent systems. Right?
And is it that these systems ultimately stem from a human or a group of humans making some sort of decision? So you can say you can have laws as a way to enact the political, but ultimately it's it's sort of base human desires or base human tribalisms which animate these things. You ultimately need some sort of human to both have these thoughts in their head to motivate them, but also a human to kinetically enact them.
I mean, that's what he tries to argue, that, for example, constitutions are ultimately based on a decision in a concrete situation. Yes. They are ultimately political.
Yeah, and he, at least in what I read of him, I didn't come across this or I don't remember it. Did he talk much about the interplay between people being motivated by certain ideas floating around? Like, for example, the idea of a constitutional order stabilizing their behavior when they then enact decisions? Is that something you talked about, or are you just not?
Can you expand on that a bit?
So at least my feeling from reading him is he didn't really address this. He kind of talked about how what ultimately motivates the political will be human desires and human wills, and a human or a legal person, if they're sovereign, will be able to enact decisions, and that's what moves forward political orders. Did he talk much? So he seemed to think that these ideas were secondary to a human concretely being able to make a decision. Did he talk much about the feedback of the existence of an idea influencing human decision making that the human then enacts in a sovereign way?
Yes, I mean, there are different ways to approach this, and I guess one way is when we talk about politicization, right, and the neutralizations. Because it's my contention that Schmitt has really two different theories concerning the political here. So yes, we know the Wikipedia version is friend enemy. He was a Nazi or something like that. But on the one hand, and I talked before about a difference between friend and enemy, because on the one hand you have dichotomies, where you establish dichotomies, friend enemy, right? And then the question becomes, who decides on these dichotomies, which is, I think, one of the problems of the concept of the political, right? Because it's not exactly clear who decides on these dichotomies, but we have to say that if we're talking about a functioning sovereign state, it's probably the sovereign that decides, right? So he writes in the concept of the political that the participants in a conflict need to decide. Okay, so who are the participants in a conflict? Well, if we're thinking about a war between states, he's saying the leaders decide, right? I just need to... My battery is running out. I just need to plug in my computer.
Oh, of course. Because my first thought hearing you say that, and by the way, this is part of the reason why we have you on, that you being able to say, I think Schmitt has at least two ways of thinking about this, which is great, because it's not something I would have picked up on. But yet hearing you talking about how, okay, it's the leaders who decide on who friends and enemies are in a conflict. To me, the existence of a conflict seems to already presuppose friends and enemies. It feels a bit circular.
Yes. So, and in a later work, Theory of the Partisan, it's called in English, he expands on this, right? And he expands on different kinds of enmity, basically, because if you think about what he writes in the concept of political, you can see that it's kind of doesn't fully make sense, because it's not clear there's an ambiguity also, because at one point he says he has one tendency always to stress that these things are very open. Like I said, for example, the state is one solution. It's not the solution. We can think of empires or tribes or right. Similarly, he sometimes stresses that, of course, conflicts might, result from any number of different factors. The enemy can be more or less familiar or different. So, on the other hand, he has this tendency to say the enemy is existentially alien, and it doesn't really make sense. So later on, he expands on this, right? And expands on exactly this question on who decides on the enemy. What kind of enemies are there, right? And he comes up with three types: conventional, absolute, and real enemies. So if we have conventional enemies, and we talk about state warfare, okay, so depending on how the state is specifically organized, but the state leadership decides, and the enemy can be perfectly conventional, and there's no need for any kind of invoking this form of existence or culture or the enemy being existentially alien and so on, right? It's just like, okay, Sweden invades Norway in the 18th century because the king decides that, right? The Norwegians aren't particularly alien. There's nothing particularly deep or culture about it. It's just like a power play by the king.
Tomorrow.
Yeah. On the other hand, of course, you have genocidal conflicts about religion. And that's very different, right? You also have these instances where some lunatic decides, well, you're now my enemies. I think of, since I'm in Sweden, I think of Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian, who, if you remember, right? For example, he decided, like, okay, these Norwegian children and teenagers, they are now my existential enemies, right? He makes the decision. There's nothing conventional about it. So you have these different kinds of enemies and different ways, different kinds of people making decisions. So this is the one. This is the one theory. We didn't get to the other one yet. The other one is.
Can I just ask? Sorry, before we jump onto the second, I definitely want to hear your second. The second theory, but in the case of Anders, did Breivik, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. That's an individual making the decision to declare who his enemy is. Can you speak a little bit to? Is it within the framework of at least Schmitt's thinking? Is that even a legitimate form of the political because it's an individual, or is it how much of Schmitt's thinking is inherently collectivist? Can individuals make those sorts of decisions, or is that would that just be that's him making an individual choice? He can't. That's not a political thing to do, even though he's saying friend enemy. It's him as an individual choosing to have that conflict versus like. Two separate religious groups, for example?
I mean, I think that's a good question, because if you base your understanding on the political in terms of deadly violence, okay, so what's the limit, right? If we have two individuals fighting, is that the political, right? And in the concept of the political, he does, as you remember, he always stresses groups. But later on, he does move more towards, individuals can declare enmity in relation to groups, right?
Okay.
Yeah. But this has been discussed. Like ultimately, you could say, okay, fine. If you have two individuals fighting to death, in some sense, it is political, right? And this, it also goes back to. We talked about Aristotle, because Aristotle he always stresses the group, right? Group coordination as the criterion. But if you completely abandon that and you only focus on deadly conflict, yes, then you could ultimately say that, sure, if you have two individuals fighting, in some sense, that is the political then.
And what about...
but I would say it's not necessarily an interesting instance of the of the political.
Yeah, sure. What about the mechanism by which the collective initiates the violence with another collective? So, for example, if you lived in a fully autocratic state where you have just a single individual is ultimately sovereign and can make the choice to go to war. Obviously, there are a lot of different discussions about why one person or a party or whatever could be considered a legitimate, the legitimate sovereign on behalf of a people, whether it's like Mussolini's ideology or some of the stuff around like monarchies and the instantiation of like acting on behalf of God or whatever, or a whole range of them. But what are the constraints on where that individual making a decision in their potential, most likely in their own self-interest, but then claiming to act on behalf of the collective? How does that get conceptualized?
Yeah, there's there's a lot to say about that, but on the okay, we could turn to Hobbes, right? And then we talk about, okay, fine, but if you have a sovereign that keeps order, right? They legitimately make decisions based on they're keeping order, right? Which creates a bit of a dilemma, because if the sovereign is legitimate because they keep us safe, how can they then initiate a deadly conflict that doesn't keep us safe? So it depends basically on what level of generality we look at the question of legitimacy, because Schmitt, on the one hand, he's a theorist of democracy. So if you want to say what makes a decision democratic, you get one discussion, right? But what makes something political is not really about if it's democratically legitimate or not. If you have two groups fighting each other, then it is political, right? It's more the brute fact of it, right? But Schmitt does also describe or theorize the democratic angle, which is a very interesting discussion in itself. But I think you can also just read the theory of the political as just descriptive and say, okay, if you manage to persuade a group to go out and fight another group, that is political.
It's a criterion for what's political.
And also there's more to say about this, because he also both Schmitt and Hobbes do. I mean, Hobbes does argue for a shared religion, also as a way of maintaining social coherence, and Schmitt also argues in similar terms for, you have mechanisms that are not democratic but that keep society more or less coherent,
like cultural or whatever.
Yes, and rituals and symbols, narratives.
And so what about, I'd be intrigued to hear your second conceptualization.
Because here we get to politicization. So politicization that's a process, right? And here it's not a dichotomy, but it's more or less politicized, right? So this is a spectrum, and politicization isn't in itself about declaring or categorizing. What it says is that the closer this process gets to the eruption of deadly violence, the more politicized it is. Right?
Yeah, right.
And and you could think of these two sort of turning back to the question of individuals. Yes, I mean, you could theoretically think of a hyper-politicized situation or kind of a zombie apocalypse where the zombies turn on each other, where you don't have any declaration of friends and enemies, you don't have any groupings, but you have, strictly speaking, a hyper-politicized situation because it's, or as Hobbes says, the war of all against all, right? So this means that the work of the political leader is essentially to keep, I think politicization is always ongoing, right? It's always ongoing. People are always more or less politicized in relation to some issue or conflict. And the trick of the political leader is to channel this into these dichotomies of friend and enemy. That's a big part of the skills they need, right? And states and laws are efficient ways of doing that, right? So of making sure that Breivik is the exception, the rare exception, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think you need to think of it in terms of politicization processes always ongoing and inescapable. And leadership is to great extent about channeling this in the appropriate ways. And right, and you use rituals and symbols and ideologies and laws and all this to do that. Sorry, I just forgot because yes, and then he has this fascinating idea of the neutralizations and the neutral domains, right?
That's exactly what I was about to ask about.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Where you try and find a kind of a neutral domain, and then that domain becomes politicized at the basis of enmity, right? And then which is
a bit more on neutralization, because one thing that really struck me reading Schmitt was he seems very nervous about the disappearance of the political, but it was a little bit unclear to me what precisely he meant, both by the disappearance of the political and if it's even possible, and two, what that would look like and what the negative outcome would be, because at times, both in the concept of the political and then in the, I think it was a talk he gave in Barcelona in 29, the age of neutralizations and depoliticizations, he seems to be saying that you can never get rid of the political. A group of people can stop trying to be political, but then they're just going to be overrun by a more coherent group united by the political. I think in the context of this speech, specifically the Soviet Union overrunning Europe to the west of it. But then at other times he seems to be saying that it's almost in a more metaphysical sense, humans, if they lose the political, they in some sense lose what it is to be human and lose this self-making quality. And he seemed to be talking about that in the context of technics, of the technical overwhelming the human, and humans just becoming this neutralized mass without any sort of ability to create themselves. So could you clear up for me what precisely he was scared of, or what he was nervous about with depoliticization and neutralization?
I mean, on the one hand, I would like to say that I don't think it's almost metaphysical, but it is metaphysical because he is a Catholic thinker. And ultimately, I think for him, it's only the return of Christ that can realistically and in a good way end the political, right? Because think of what it would mean to end the political without a religious solution. What kind of society would that realistically be? Would it be a utopia? Because when he talks about the political, he talks about the potential for deadly violence. So ending the political means ending the potential for deadly violence. That means, well, it means the potential to overthrow a regime, right? So what would a unified world without this religious solution, what kind of world would that be where people lack even the potential for violence?
It could be just totally static or totally determined.
Yes, and what measures would be needed to remove this potential? I mean, to be fair to Schmitt, would that be a utopia? I don't think so. Right? You can think of some severely controlled society, right? If you want to remove even this potential, it's easily, conceived of as quite scary scenario, because we might think of the political only as a bad thing because violence is bad, but well, depending on the context, it might not be a bad thing that people are able to overthrow a regime, right? So I think the political is also a source of hope. It's not just a bad thing. And if you want to be generous to Schmitt, you can say what he's saying is, yes, if Christ returns, and fine, then we can live without violence. But absent that, what we would need to conceive of is something much less appetizing, right?
Is the term for this kind of thinking realpolitik? Is that the correct me if I'm wrong? It's like kind of like trying to be quote unquote realistic about not not utopian about we can create some. So what's the question I'm kind of asking?
No, I mean I think in IR studies, in international relations studies, you have the school of realism, right? It's called realism, and Schmitt is one of the main sources of inspiration for that. So
cool.
Yeah.
And underneath this, it's as you said, like, yes, there's trade-offs. On the one hand, violence, but on the other hand, if you don't have at least the potential for groups, maybe sometimes not having legitimate reasons to go, but also I think most people would think could pretty easily conceive of times when it's when for whatever reason they think it's legitimate to use violence at the collective level. For example, if you're being invaded by another country or something, most states are going to say, no, we're not just going to let you come in and take our land or whatever.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, because we talk about even the potential, right? So if you don't have even the potential, imagine a world government where people lack even the potential to use violence in protest, right? It's like I can understand why that might not be. Yeah. So.
Could you speak to us? Unless, sorry, it's getting a little bit late here. I'm not sure if I've followed everything. Jack, do you have any questions? Oh, I'm just going over my notes. And I'll let you ask a question.
There are a lot of different ways we can go. Could you? Because I think this is a really interesting idea, and I'm sure a lot of listeners get a lot out of this. Schmitt's idea of central domains shifting and trying to move to a more neutral central domain, and then that growing politicized, and then that continued movement. Could you speak a bit more to that? Because I found that was a really interesting idea, particularly with respect to his idea of technology as something which isn't a possible central domain, because it can be used by basically anyone to enforce their political will. It's not this, I guess, centripetal force.
How long are we gonna continue just to address that issue? I think, as you say, it's getting also late for Levi.
We can go for another half hour or so, or even less, depending on your needs as well. I'm not going to force you to continue speaking.
Right. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, this notion of neutralization and supposedly neutral domains, and how Schmitt conceives as the political, and so basically you can think of neutralization as saying like, okay, this is just a neutral issue of the central bank decides on the interest rate, and that's just a technical issue, right? Or, as I said, in terms of courts and human rights, as you've talked about previous on the podcast, you seem to have some problems about that in Australia. I don't know. You mentioned kangaroo courts. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound good. You remove certain issues from contestation by saying, okay, this is more of a technical issue, right? What you often see is in a conflict, you often have antagonists that share an idea of what the important core domain is, right? So you see this very often in political philosophy and in ideologies, that the supposedly highly antagonistic sides are very much in agreement on something. So ethno-nationalists and multiculturalists are very much in agreement that culture is very important, and it needs to be protected by the state, right? So on the one hand, okay, they seem to be very antagonistic, but on the other hand, they completely agree on this. Or Marxists and libertarians are very much in agreement on exploitation and the centrality of economy, right? But they disagree on who is exploiting whom and so on. And you see that these domains shift. So you see a historical trajectory where some domains are politicized and then abandoned, right? Think of, as we said, Catholicism and Protestantism is like a non-issue in large parts of Europe. Used to be the basis for war. Everyone agrees that this question is super important, and the question of the organization of the church and theology and blah blah, super important, right? They agree, but they disagree on the the specifics. So you have these shifts historically. Although it's not like completely consistent, some people will still idiosyncratically hold on to these conflicts. Another important, I think, tendency Schmitt points to is how certain people will have this idea that, oh, if we can only fix this core domain, everything else will just fall into place, right? We only need to ensure that we have the correct state religion, or we only need to, if we take care of the economy, we won't have any problems with culture anymore, or if we only fix, if we only get our correct institutionalization of nationalism, the economy will take care of it. So he points to I think lots of interest. It's very schematic, but you can see this movement, and I think you can see more broadly and obviously how different questions are politicized and depoliticized. Democracy is a good example. Democracy was first basically depoliticized because no one was a democrat. If you go back a few hundred years,
one solution.
Right? It's democracy is something you caution against. Like, oh no, whatever you do, avoid this democracy thing. And then it becomes politicized. Some people are like, oh, maybe it is, maybe it is a good idea. And then it becomes depoliticized again. Like, oh, of course and now it's politicized again, right? So you have these constant movements of politicization and depoliticization. That's. But when you talk about like an absolute depoliticization, yes, we're talking about this kind of removing even the potential from earthly life. That's something different. But the continuous movements of politicization and depoliticization are, so to speak, completely normal in a sense. Like we have these continuous movements. But then Schmitt has this sort of underlying current criticizing technicity and nihilism, which is an obscure undercurrent throughout his works. He returns to it repeatedly, but it's never very clearly articulated. But I think it goes back to political theology and the fundamental conflict he points to there between, as we talked about this earlier, between modes of thinking that try to construe these coherent systems with no outside. This is something he repeatedly attacks throughout his works, that kind of thinking. And his preferred mode of thinking, where yes, you can construe these systems, but they should theorize the relation to the outside. And this also ties into religion for him. So Catholicism for him is a way of thinking about the relation to the metaphysical outside, right? And in terms of sovereignty, right? Sovereignty is a way of thinking the relation between order and the outside of order. And the sovereign theorizes that link, because the sovereign is prepared to venture outside of order to preserve order, right? So sovereign is the link to this outside, because in these liminal situations where you relate to something outside, that is also how you generate new orders and new systems. So if you put it concretely, if you have social chaos, this is a liminal stage where either you preserve the existing order or you create a new order, and the sovereign is that link. So if we go back to Weimar, that was exactly the question: are we going to keep this Weimar order, or are we going to create a new order? Okay. Same with religion. If you talk about revelation, for example, it's a link to the divine, and a revelation is that link, because if you have another revelation, well, okay, then you create a new religion instead. So you're in that liminal situation. So I think that's the kind of the underlying idea that he has about how to think about order. And for him, technicity is kind of destroys that. It's this kind of spirit of just trying to, and I think it's also ties into this critique of instrumentalization that we find in a lot of German-speaking thought in the 20th century, where they in various ways view technology. The dangers of technology it's not primarily about technological gadgets, but it's about the ways in which those gadgets amass and are tied to, in different ways, to a way of experiencing the world and acting in the world, where everything is ultimately reduced to a homogenized sort of pool of resources. Right? For Heidegger, the Bestand, and for Schmitt, he talks about technicity. But that's I think the deepest fear, where technicity would destroy all these links in different areas. When it comes to the spatial order, he talks about the kind of the sacred orientations and sacred sites as ultimately linking the spatial order to something outside. And so I think it's a deep layer in his thought. It's not super clearly articulated, but it's about this his general fear of these attempts at creating coherent, smooth systems where we don't think about the relation to the outside.
Well, thank you for talking about that, because the first time I read Schmitt, I've said this to you before we started recording, but for listeners, I won't be repeating myself. The first time I read Schmitt, I wasn't very familiar with particularly early 20th century German-speaking thought. But then I read a number of people from the conservative revolution in Germany where talking about technics was really, really prominent, and then read Schmitt again. And then having that background, it jumped out at me, that undercurrent of fear of a totally technical world. It's really, really striking and really interesting.
Yes, because they're always talking about not the gadgets, right? But it's not difficult to perceive, even if this critique is often sort of vague and sweeping, you can see it, right? The notions of human resources and whatnot. These processes of, I sometimes use the example of money, right? Where if I want to withdraw some money from an ATM, and it won't ask me like, which $10 do you want to withdraw? It's a senseless, money is just a pool of homogenized resources, right? Whereas you go back historically, I bartered this knife for this whatnot, right? It's very concrete, and it's not reducible to something you can just exchange. So as human beings, we have some relations where this resource mode of homogeneous resources doesn't make sense, and that is something that puts a limit on justice, for example, and redistribution, and hopefully to some extent on market exchange, right? Another very clear example, of course, is children, right? It wouldn't make sense to say I have 3 children, you have none, so it should be fair, right? It makes no sense.
Yeah, to give someone
right,
1.5.
Redistribute.
1.5.
But what they see is a tendency to increasingly, right, turn everything as much as possible into this kind of pool of exchangeable resources. And you can see these tendencies in various ways. You can see it in the organization of work, where in many organizations the ideal is that people should just be not only replaceable but also interchangeable. Right? You should be able to move them around, just as, and so on. So. So I think that's kind of the fear they're grappling with, and they see technology as part of this larger process. Right?
And presumably, like I suppose economics as well, as the sort of market mechanism unrestrained. Is this also where a lot of it sounds like there's a lot of clash with the emphasis on economic relations in liberalism. Am I misunderstanding? Yes.
No. And this is what Schmitt writes in the concept of the political, that liberalism has this tendency to translate everything into issues of either ethics or economics. And he wants to insist on the precedence on the political, and this is what has attracted lots of people both on the left and the right. Again, go back to the central bank is independent and it decides. So according to him, then liberalism would have translated what is a political issue up for contestation into some kind of technical economic issue. This is or let's say migration. People will say like, okay, migration is good for the economy, and then right-wingers will say, well, yeah, but Schmitt emphasizes that it's ultimately a political issue. It's not. Or you can take ethics again with rights, where you say, well, it's a matter of rights. It's for the courts to decide. It's not it's beyond contestation for us. Yeah. So I
Did
think,
you want to talk about before we wrap up in the last like sort of 10 minutes or so, sort of contemporary applications of it, Jack? Also, we've got Stuart coming
yeah.
up.
Well, I'd hope John would talk about that, because he'll probably know much more about it than me. Yeah, talking about both Schmitt in the modern world, and then, if you don't mind and you have time, your critiques of Schmitt's solutions, because you did note earlier in the episode that he's good at picking out weaknesses, particularly in liberalism, very saliently for us.
Yeah.
But his solutions are much more problematic.
I mean, I think you two have talked about this also on the podcast of error correction, and I think some critics of liberal democracy tend to forget the very substantial advantages, right? I mean, the way in which Schmitt is used to argue for a strong sovereign has, democracy has this huge advantage of error correction and accountability. And I mean, if you have this sovereign making exceptional decisions, okay, what if you're targeted by those, and how do you how do you ensure the sovereign stops at a certain point? So, and also I think he generalizes a lot from Weimar to sort of implying that all liberal democracies have these problems. I don't think that's true. I think lots of people sort of think overemphasize the weaknesses of problems of liberal democracy, and then kind of underemphasize or gloss over the many problems with other solutions, right? So
I guess I have two questions. Maybe one's a bit of a faster one. The first one was like following up from that, like did the questions really just fall out of my head that quickly? Sorry. The question was so how did he constrain, like at what point does the sovereign what are the constraints on how many times, to what degree the sovereign can make exceptions for itself?
If I can jump in and just ask, like, at least in my reading in political theology, there just aren't restrictions. Otherwise, the sovereign's not sovereign. Is that completely misreading it?
No, I think he has that. I mean, that is a big... And, I mean, we could talk another hour about his analysis of democracy. He has many good... he has many good points, but it's... Yeah. But I do, I think he has a short book that's called in English "The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy," and which you might read if you're interested in, because it's brief and it's well written, but. I think, I mean, this is the key problem, or one of the really key problems for non-democrats. Just to pick up one theme, so Schmitt is early in recognizing the tension between liberalism and democracy, meaning that if you see democracy as popular sovereignty, and you see liberalism as emphasizing individual rights, the two are in tension. You can't maximize both. And so some libertarians will sort of maximize liberty and hence be against democracy, for example. And this idea is quite prevalent, I think, today on the NRX, right? You've talked about this notion of... sort of liberty without democracy, but it's very unclear to me how you then keep liberty. And so I think one general problem, which sounds silly but isn't, is the overtime problem, right? So the trick for political thinking isn't just to come up with a functioning system, but also a system that can function over time. So, how do you make sure that your, libertarian system doesn't quite quickly develop into something else? Right, it's kind of a key. It sounds silly, but it's a real
silly
problem.
at all. It's how does it maintain coherence in space and time?
Yes, coherence, and how do you maintain these? How do you maintain liberties without democracy? Right. So democracy encroaches on liberties, but how do you maintain them without democracy is one
I
key
often
problem.
find that if you listen to somebody who's very ideological about these things, whether it's like anarcho-capitalists or libertarians or Marxists or whatever, it seems to me that they ignore the question of trade-offs. Like when I've read, say, Popper, for example, he's not. He doesn't say, "Oh, democracy is like some perfect system" or whatever. In fact, he talks about like piecemeal problem solving, and that it's a patchwork of solutions to practical problems that actually concretely existed, and there'll be more problems to solve. And I always found that there's at least, I guess maybe that's why I found this idea of like error correction stuff appealing, is because there's room for trade-offs. We can say, okay, well, in America, they've got a very good system for creating a huge amount of wealth in a very short amount of time, but they've also got a slew of other issues. Whereas like Australia maybe doesn't have the same wealth generation capabilities on a per capita basis, but we've, like it's pretty great to live in Australia. If you're, and so, but you can have this conversation around sort of practical trade-offs, but then in very ideological, or like in schools of thinking where almost purity, like ideological purity matters, you discard trade-off based thinking. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of post Schmitt in modern contexts. What are the how have you, I don't know if this is something that you're exposed to very much in your own career, but where have people taken it, Schmitt's thinking now these days, and has it evolved? Have those dialogues evolved in academic settings to talk more nuancedly about trade-offs, or is there still a very pure a matter of purity in the conversations?
It's funny. I mean, my whole thinking about autonomy is all about trade-offs. So I mean, I completely agree that lots of people want to crank something up to the max. Just it's pretty silly. There is just so much about Schmitt these days. It's really hard to get some overview, because there's so many different areas it ties into, right? I mean, because we've only touched upon some topics here, right? We have just but are you thinking about democracy specifically, or some other? I mean, because there's so much more we could say. Speaking of that, just one brief thing to mention is that in one way, Schmitt's theory of sovereignty is not particularly provocative or profound. Because in one way you could view it as pretty trivial that the sovereign has the capacity to decide on the exception. Just maybe wanted to mention that, but for him it's I mean, in a sense, in any political system, there is the potential to some way or other introduce exceptional measures. It's not that big of a deal. It's a kind of a general understanding, but it's also, for him, it's tied very specifically to the president and the Weimar situation. But speaking of trade-offs, I mean, I have to again mention Chantal Mouffe as the one who has, I think, done the most to build on what we're talking about, the notion of the political. And she has written a book on the political, which is also an easy read. And this is over 20 years old now, but I think it was quite relevant when it first came out. She basically said that back then there was this kind of convergence in the middle that we saw in the Western world with New Labour and Bill Clinton, and it's kind of and her idea was that this was dangerous, that exactly they tried to suppress the political in politics, and she said this will lead to some kind of, you know, reaction, right? Basically what happened, right? She what then happened, she thought would happen. And so but her solution was to emphasize the political. We again, back in her context, which was much less ideological than the present situation, but to turn antagonism into agonism, so to kind of disarm the deadly violence aspect of it. And she has sort of continued writing, but that's, I think, still the one I think of as the most prominent writing specifically about the political. And yeah, obviously you can think about how that disarming would actually look, because she just sketches that, but you might be thinking more of the trade-offs between liberty and democracy. Is that correct? I think she emphasizes. I mean, this is a basic tension of liberal democracies. This is why I think liberal democracy is a good term, because liberal democracy is not a democracy in the classical sense. It is exactly a liberal democracy with components that cannot be maximized simultaneously. And one of the fundamental trade-offs is about what's the extent of majority decisions and the extent of minority and individual rights. That is one of the basic trade-offs of liberal democracy. And I would say in general, in Europe at least, the tendency has been to expand the rights aspect.
Yeah, interesting.
In terms of the nation states, but on the other hand, you've also moved legislative capacity to the EU level. So it's a complex picture, right?
Yeah,
but
very simple problem with very simple solutions.
I mean, Schmitt points to even deeper problems about thinking about democracy, and ultimately we get this question of how to define the collective. And it's deep problems.
So I have one more question to ask before we wrap it up, Jack. But did you have any others, Jack?
No, ask your question.
My final
problem
question
is I have probably several hours of questions, but I just don't want to keep John here all day.
Yeah. But I mean, maybe if we do political theology or something, we could have John back and something if you'd like. But my final question is, well, we obviously have, I would think essentially all of our listeners are from Western countries, at least according to the analytics that we get access to, and seem to be mostly sort of in their 20s and 30s. So probably have only ever really been exposed substantively to Western liberal democracies. What would be the one or two most impactful takeaways from Schmitt's work, especially the concept of the political for, I suppose, sort of young adults living in the current ideological landscape that we're living in now in Western countries at the moment? From your readings of all of this, John, what's worth learning for us?
From this specific work, I do think you should absolutely get the edition which includes the essay on neutralizations and depoliticizations, because that's a very good edition, and I think it's to think of societies as continuously in these streams of politicizations and depoliticizations is very good thing to remember. I would also avoid a simplistic reading. Maybe that's, but just avoid reducing it to a simplistic understanding of friend enemy according to preset criteria, because that's not what Schmitt is saying, and more so try to see it in terms of potentials. That's how I think of it, not just see the surface, like this is my current understanding of the world in terms of in and out groups, but rather you have these potentials for the political that can emerge. You have these constant movements of politicizations and depoliticizations, and let Schmitt challenge you. That's rather than just reinforce some. In general, I like to read him as encouraging intellectual openness. And well, to think of the enemy as a question, right?
It's a good way of putting it. I have been cooking up like just mental frameworks for thinking about the world over the course of my adult life. One of which was I took from The Sovereign Individual, which was the idea of centralization and decentralization as an important axis moving throughout, I suppose, the social, technological, political sphere, and looking at like, is this thing becoming more or less centralized? Like, what's the vector doing on this thing? And now I feel like I've acquired a new axis to like analyze the world. Like, is this particular part of society becoming more or less like more politicized or more depoliticized? And I almost wonder, like, as something to think about for me at least, is like, do those axes like centralization, decentralization interact somehow with politicization, depoliticization, and the other sort of things that I've thought about? And really, really interesting, especially what I got out of this concept. I think what you helped me or illuminated for me in particular, John, was the dynamic nature of the window of politicization. Really, really interesting concept. I'll have to think about that. But Jack, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah. So you can answer this question if you like, John, or not. So we finish episodes by saying, do we recommend this book or not? And so I would recommend it. I like reading Schmitt because he's clear, he's practical in that he was addressing clear problems in his time, And he's a really interesting critic of liberalism. He's not of the liberal tradition, but observed it very closely and offered some critiques that I think still hold today. I would really recommend people get the edition. I think it's Chicago. It's either Chicago or MIT Press. I think it's Chicago, of The Concept of the Political. It's a bright orange book with the age of neutralizations and depoliticizations at the end, because that lecture really sums up the very interesting parts of the concept of the political and then offers new frameworks with which to approach the world, which I thought were really good. That was the part of the book that made me really think, wow, this guy's worth paying attention to. So I'd recommend this, especially with that essay attached to it. What about you, Levi?
Yeah, and I would echo that as well. And of all the people that we've read who do criticize liberal democracy or liberalism, probably one of the more, what would you say, not just straightforward, but say, I don't know if I have a better way of putting it, but worthy of taking it seriously.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I feel like I read them some and I'm just like, come on, man. You know, but this was a really, really worth reading. And also just given the context of being present during the instability of Weimar, it's like Junger, he's speaking from the inside of these. Now we see them in very historically important events in Western Europe. So not to, I would almost say that like just thinking of Schmitt as, oh, just a Nazi or something is such an unhelpful way to conceptualize him as a person and his problem situation and the context of his life in which he was trying to solve these like very practical political problems, which were, you know, tearing Western Europe apart, tearing Germany apart. So yeah, really, really interesting, really worth reading. Yeah. John.
I'd also say, worth reading because particularly in the online right, you get Twitter Schmitt, which is like qualitatively different from Schmitt. So it's worth reading what Schmitt actually says rather than what some anon on Twitter says he said.
What some meme poster on Twitter.
They just get it wrong or make it so simplistic that it loses any of the interesting parts of Schmitt.
Yeah. And John, would you recommend this book?
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, yeah.
So let's wrap up. But last little plug, John, if anybody wants to email you, I know we've got a lot of really interesting people. There might be somebody who's interested in reaching out to you academically. Again, page on your university's website. You can look it up. I don't know how you pronounce your university's name. Ulma? Is that how you say? Malmö.
Yeah, I think Malmö is the English pronunciation.
Is that, I don't know how to pronounce an O with.
No, it's Malmö in Swedish.
Malmö.
So
yeah. Yeah. So look up John. Email him if you're interested in his stuff. Is there anything else, Jack?
No, I just want to say thank you again. That was great. It's really good talking to people who have a deep knowledge of these sorts of works, who can bring things out of them that Levi or I would not have necessarily seen.
Yeah, absolutely cannot. We'd be sitting in your classroom, mate.
Yeah.
Asking questions.
You so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you again, John.
Thanks so much.
And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening. See you next time.